Okay, we'll make a start. So firstly, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Duncan Callow, and I'm from Indicator, and I'll be hosting this webinar, which is called Handling Redundancies in 2026, What SMEs Need to Know. Now, if you're part of an SME business, you don't need me to tell you that redundancies are one of the most difficult things that any employer can face. And for SMEs in particular, it can be stressful, emotional, and legally risky. It's also a fact that due to several reasons, such as the increase in the national minimum wage and national insurance, we're seeing a definite uptick in the number of redundancies. In fact, unemployment is now above 5%. So today we'll walk you through the practical steps that employers should follow to manage redundancies safely and fairly. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll cover what redundancy actually means in legal terms, the steps that you as an employer should follow, and some very common mistakes that we see businesses are making and how you can avoid those. We need to be clear that we're not going to overwhelm you with legal jargon. We want to give you, as is the norm for all Indicator content, we want to give you practical guidance that you can apply in your business on a day-to-day basis. And I'm delighted to be joined by Rhiannon Davies, who's a solicitor specialising in employment law, and she'll be guiding us through all the legal and practical detail. So, Rhiannon, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Duncan. Afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm hoping to make this next 45 minutes or so as interesting as possible in this run through handling redundancies in 2026. So if we just move to the next slide, which will confirm exactly what we're going to cover today. And as you can see there, we're going to go through when a situation is a genuine redundancy, the correct redundancy process, consultation, which I'll go through in the most detail because that is vital to running a fair redundancy process, the redundancy pay and notice that's involved, common mistakes, and also practical tips and to reduce your risks. So next slide, please, and why this matters. So making mistakes during a redundancy can lead to unfair dismissal claims, discrimination claims, the costs related to going through the employment tribunal, and damage to existing staff. The process is so important as much as the outcome to that. So if we just run to the next slide, what is redundancy? One of the biggest misconceptions employers have is that redundancy can be unfair, but actually when you run a genuine redundancy situation, it's good for the business, but the process is absolutely critical. The tribunal claims that often arise is not because the redundancy wasn't justified, but it's because the employer didn't follow the correct procedure. So you'll find that I'll be repeating that point quite a lot through this talk now on the procedural elements of a redundancy process. The reason why the risk can be quite high for SMEs is that many SMEs don't have their own HR teams or legal advice available, which means that those risks are very high. What is redundancy? So legally, a redundancy has a very specific meaning. As that slide says, it's where a business closes, a workplace within a business can close, or where there is a lesser need for a particular type of role or work. Again, quite repetitive on this point is it's not about the person who's in that role, it's about the job that's disappearing, or the jobs in plural. You may find that the examples that come up when you find yourself in a redundancy situation is that the demand has dropped, you're restructuring, so you see that there's a need within a certain department within your business that needs to be restructured. But the key point again is that it's the role or the roles that's disappearing. So if we just move on to the next slide. So this naturally follows that we're explaining now what a redundancy is not. So this is often a common mistake made by employers. Sometimes employers think that redundancy is a way of removing an employee simply. That's not the case. If you wanted to remove an employee, it's usually for other reasons, such as poor performance, misconduct, personality conflicts, or just simply trying to get rid of someone. These require completely different processes. A fair redundancy is one where it's for a genuine redundancy reason from the previous slide. And if you don't do that, that's where you can quickly find yourself in a very difficult situation, facing unfair dismissal claims or any of those other claims that I've listed. On to the next slide. Again, redundancy is the last resort. A redundancy process isn't one that has the outcome of a redundancy being the decision. A redundancy process should be followed to avoid a redundancy. So before you start that redundancy process, you need to be looking at what you can do before that redundancy decision is made. So I've listed here considering any hiring freezes, reduction in hours, redeployment, voluntary redundancies, and restructuring of roles that exist. So if you do get into that situation where you're facing an unfair dismissal, the tribunal's often looking at whether the employer was genuinely looking at redundancy being the last resort. So even if the redundancies go ahead, you need to show that you considered these alternatives. So we'll go on to the next slide, which is separated into 3 steps. So the first step being confirming the business case. So what I would like to see in any business case would be detail and data and documents to show why the business has decided that redundancy is what is the process that needs to be gone through. So this might be that you have a contract that's been cancelled on you, or it's coming to an end. Generally a downturn in business, so you want to have a document of the figures that demonstrate that, or that you have looked at restructuring to grow your business. All of that would be best placed in a document, which I would call the business case. Again, that is what a tribunal would be looking at when they're analysing whether there was a genuine redundancy situation.
Can I just ask a question there, Rhiannon, please?
Of course.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about this business case situation. I mean, we're seeing the adoption of AI a lot at the moment, and it could be that AI is doing away with the whole layer of stuff. Could that be a reason?
It could be, yes. If you could justify that that has been considered as a genuine way that your business could grow and you could save costs, absolutely. But the key would be that you would document that as a business decision and one that's been carefully thought out. And, you know, AI could even help you to explain exactly how much that would save you in terms of costs.
Yeah, sure.
So again, it's all down to the evidence at the point of making that decision, so that you're showing that it's not predetermined in any way.
Thanks.
Okay. So that's the first step in any redundancy process. If we move on to step 2, identifying your selection pool. So once you have gone through that process of documenting exactly what your business case is, you're looking at who does the same or similar work. In this scenario, we're using a marketing team as an example. So within that marketing team, again, as Duncan said, AI might be one of those things that could have been looked into to save on costs. You've got 4 people working within your marketing team and you're looking to remove 1. So you've got that selection pool of 4. And then that naturally falls onto the next step, step 3. Once you have that selection pool, you need to be looking at the selection criteria to score those 4 people that you've chosen within that selection pool. And it's very important that the selection criteria needs to be objective. So I've given examples here of objective criteria: skills and qualifications, performance records, disciplinary history, and attendance. Objectivity, again, key here. I've said at that point that any subjective criteria may land you in a difficult position. because it's very difficult to score on those without being biased potentially, which I'll go on to later. But as long as you're scoring those within the selection pools objectively, then you're doing the right thing as part of the process. So we move on to the next slide. In the introduction, I did say that I would talk a lot about consultation because this is fundamental to any redundancy process. It is one of the most important steps, and the entire purpose of a consultation, and a meaningful consultation, which you'll see I've put there, is to go through what the process is with the employees, explain what the proposal is. You'll most probably be referring to the business case document that I mentioned just now. It's your opportunity to take feedback from the employees who are involved, and also to consider any alternatives, again, before any decisions are made finally on making anyone redundant. So a decision should not already be final before the consultation begins. As obvious as that sounds, any tribunal will be looking at how that decision was reached and to look for anything that could be looked at as a predetermined decision. Move on to the next slide. Again, this is in relation to consultation. So consultation is divided into two different kinds. There's individual consultation and collective consultation, which sometimes can sound quite complex to employers, but it involves the numbers of people involved. So collective consultation will only be applicable if you are making 20 or more redundancies within 90 days, which doesn't usually apply to SMEs, who won't be making such large redundancies. Again, if you are in that situation, the numbers are important. So the individual consultation is the one that I will focus on today. So I'll move on to the next slide, which is the consultation meeting itself. It usually involves more than one meeting because, as I said, you need to be demonstrating that you're genuinely going through a meaningful process. You're meeting with these employees, you're explaining why they're in that position and how the scoring works, how the selection criteria works. The employees also have the opportunity to ask any questions. They may even be able to suggest alternatives that you haven't thought of as part of your initial thoughts when you started the process. And then following that initial meeting, there'll be a follow-up meeting before you make the final decision, which I've listed in that slide. The next slide. So again, part of this consultation, I've already mentioned that this would fall into any redundancy decision, is that you're looking as to whether there are any alternative roles within your business, because you're looking to either redeploy or employ them within any alternative role. If a role exists in the business, it's important to explain it, obviously. But one thing that a lot of employers find difficult during this particular element of redundancy is that they feel they need to be looking for something. But actually, your obligation is to offer any suitable alternative. You're not under an obligation to create a role that is suitable. For example, the marketing department, back to that example, it wouldn't be suitable alternative employment to offer them a position in a different department that they're not qualified in. Again, it sounds obvious, but it's one of the stumbling blocks that I've advised on quite a lot on this particular point during a redundancy process. So if we move on to the next,
sorry,
Duncan.
Yeah, quick question. What sort of timescale are we looking at for this consultation period to last?
Using the example we've got, and also on individual consultation, it can take no more than 2 weeks. Again, maybe longer if we're talking about availability of people involved in the process, including the employees, because during the process they're entitled to be accompanied during the meeting. So sometimes it's just a logistical thing of managing the timing of the meetings, etc. But it shouldn't take any longer than that. There's no set time for individual consultations, as long as you are going through the process of having those meetings and giving them the opportunity to consider everything. And again, it may be that during that process, the employees do give you some points to think about that you hadn't had chance to think about at the time. So it may be that you need to take more time to research or look into what is discussed. Okay. So yes, the next slide is the actual confirmation of redundancy. So now we've gone through the process, we've met with the employee probably once or almost certainly twice. We've taken all the feedback on board. It may be that a suitable alternative position has been accepted, and the process effectively stops at that point. However, if we've got to the point of confirming that one employee within the marketing team, again on our worked example, that they are being made redundant, we need to provide confirmation of exactly what that means to that employee. It's probably already come up during the consultation meetings of what they would be entitled to, and when they would effectively finish. So here I've set out that it's important that we confirm the notice period, the redundancy payment, which I'll go into whether that's a statutory redundancy payment or a contractual one, and then their right of appeal against that decision. Again, this is something that I've advised a lot on, where employers think it's odd to offer this right of appeal when actually we've gone through this process, but that's their statutory entitlement to do so. And also it's your opportunity, if there has been any issues during the consultation process, to rectify anything via an appeal. Next slide. So I said, as part of a redundancy, if you've made the decision to make someone redundant, they are entitled to their notice, either their statutory notice or their contractual notice. Statutory notice is based on length of service of anything. The maximum they're entitled to is 12 weeks if they've got 12 years service or more. Contractually, if they're entitled to more than that, and they may be entitled to up to 6 months, 12 months, depending on their status in the company, but that is what they're entitled to contractually. The redundancy pay, onto the next slide. So again, statutory redundancy pay is the minimum. Your contract may offer them in excess of that, but we'll work on the basis that you offer the statutory amount. This is calculated based on the age of the employee, the weekly pay, and their length of service. So if we go back to our worked example of making this one person from the marketing team redundant, that employee is aged 45. They've got 10 years full service. Gross weekly pay is £600. So that's how much they earn. The statutory weekly cap is 751. So if they earned more than that, then you could pay them that minimum. But here in this example, they actually earn less. So we'll work it based on their actual amount. So the next slide, I believe, will set out exactly how we use those multipliers. So because this employee is over 41, we use a multiplier of 1.5. Their weekly pay is 600 and their length of service is 10. So their entitlement to statutory redundancy works out at £9,000. We would explain to that employee that £9,000 is paid in addition to their notice, and that £9,000 is tax-free as a statutory redundancy payment. So all of this needs to be explained to the employee in that final meeting where you hand over the letter, where it's all broken down to them so they understand exactly what they will be in receipt of when they're made redundant. We move on to the next slide. Common mistakes. Again, I'm drawing on what I've been discussing just now, which is predetermination is one of the biggest mistakes I've seen. Anything that can indicate that a decision has been made before you've actually considered any of those points during the consultation will more than likely result in a claim being brought, which falls within the poor consultation, the unfair selection criteria, miscalculation of redundancy pay. There's many online assistance with that on the government website, where you can input all of those figures that I went through earlier, so their age and their length of service and what they're earning gross per week. So use that to double check anything. The alternative roles are discussed, suitable alternative employment. If there's anything that you've missed during that point, that can also be a mistake during this process. And poor documentation. I couldn't emphasize more that any data, any figures, anything that is helping you decide during this redundancy process is something that a tribunal will be looking at in detail. So keep the documentation in order during the whole process. Next slide, discrimination risks. Without going into too much detail on this, because this could probably form a whole new webinar, discrimination can obviously come up during a redundancy process. The redundancy decisions must be made free of discrimination, as obvious as that sounds, but certain employees, such as those on maternity leave, do have additional protections during a redundancy process. And it's just all about taking particular care if any of these factors are involved during the redundancy process. The next slide. Again, something that's often missed is the other staff during a redundancy process. It's not just affecting the people who are directly involved in the procedure, it's also affecting the other staff. It may mean that they feel uncertain or worried about their own jobs, so it's always important to communicate very clearly what's going on. Explaining the business plan, again, back to my point on that being a very important document at the start of this process, and generally keeping the communications very clear on what is happening and when it's happening. And then on to the next slide, which is setting out a checklist. Always good to have a checklist when you start, but this one it's clear that we start at the very beginning with confirming whether there is a genuine redundancy. And then we're looking at the selection pool, the fair criteria, which are objective, the consultation with the employees, the consideration of alternative suitable employment, confirming the outcome and making the outcome very clear and on all of the elements of what that employee is entitled to, and obviously their right of appeal, and then making the payment in good time. And specifically what will be involved there is when that employee's termination date is. Next slide. So the key takeaways from this webinar today. Redundancy is about the role, not people. I went through that at the start. That will be key when you go through your business plan and you're looking at where you can save costs, or you're having to close a certain part of your business. It's not about the person. The process is critical and the consultation must be genuine. Again, making sure you're going through those steps and you're going through a genuine and fair process, and then keeping all the documentation together. Again, back to that business case, it's really important that you're able to justify your decision making and you're running the process as one that is looking to avoid making redundancies rather than any predetermined decision.
Rhiannon, I've got a
So
question, if I may. Sorry.
yes, no problem, Duncan.
No. I'm just thinking. Look, you beautifully explained the procedure and outlined the risks. What about a business that's got a member of staff who's, say, 9 months service, and it's the work that they're doing, the requirement for it has ceased or diminished? Given their length of service, do I still have to go through this process? Do I still have to consult? Do I still have to have a genuine business reason? What are the risks if I sort of shortcut the process?
A good question, one that I've been asked many times. A belt and braces approach would be to include that person with 9 months service, because then you are avoiding any risks in terms of discrimination. Yes, that employee has got less than 2 years service, so they don't have a right for unfair dismissal, but you would include them in the selection pool. However, if you wanted to look at, you could separate them out from the process and dismiss them for some other reason if you wanted to, but I would always include them within the whole redundancy process to avoid any risk.
Best to err on the side of caution.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Well, as I said, thank you for summarising the situation so eloquently. And I think it's clear that the redundancy must be genuine. You must follow a fair process, and you must go through meaningful consultation. And if you do these three things, then the chances are that you will be able to implement fair redundancy and also handle the situation compassionately and respectfully, because
Yes.
obviously somebody's going to lose their job at the end of this, or several people might, and it's important that we respect that. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to throw at Rhiannon? Well, if you do, or something comes to you a bit later on, please drop us an email or add it to the chat, and we'll get back to you in due course. Otherwise, I'd like to thank everybody for spending the last half an hour or so with us. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. Watch this space. We will be offering more employment-related webinars just like this in the weeks and months to come. But for now, once again, thank you for spending your time with us. Have a great afternoon.